Our speaker is a local Denverite who is an entrepreneur, engineer, and educator. He is CEO of Curve10, an application innovation company, and he serves as co-founder of and executive director of the University of Colorado Blockchain Alliance. It's my great pleasure to introduce Hunter Albright.
There you go. Thank you. So I guess after 2.5 days, everybody has lots of ideas, right, for the applications that you want to develop. So what we're going to do today is, this is very non-technical, so we'll walk through and I'll share some of my thoughts and what I'm seeing in terms of challenges of developing some of the applications. And then we can, happy to field questions as we go, and we'll work through. But if you want to play along, I have put up some templates that you can use now or you can use later in terms of how to think about developing an application within the decentralized space or with blockchain. And there's sort of 4 or 5 templates within there. I've also uploaded them onto Shed if you want to sort of down both the slides as well as the templates. So a little bit about me. I think I have a confession to make. I have converted from the dark side a little bit. I have spent 20 plus years in financial services. I used to run the credit card and loan portfolio for Barclays Bank in the UK. I was on the board of directors for MasterCard Europe and have worked extensively with Visa sort of globally, both in terms of their sort of university teaching within the banking system as well as with their clients. And so understand a lot of what's broken and what needs to be improved and a lot of the opportunities in that space. I also sort of live between academia and industry. I sort of am a faculty member at the University of Colorado. I teach venture planning in the business school, and I teach blockchain in the engineering school, and am executive director of the University of Colorado's Blockchain Alliance. And then, so during the day, I have an software innovation company. Okay, so some of the things that I'm starting to think more about, and it's exciting for me in terms of the applications, is really how do we get more people into the space? How do we get more people using technology, using applications, and how do we get more people inventing it? And so when I've started to think more about applications, there's 2 questions that tend to come to mind. One is just how do we introduce the technology to people? And I think one of the things I'll touch on is, I think there's the destination out there about how we have everything sort of completely decentralized and sort of open, but it's really hard to make that in one sort of big jump. And so some thoughts on applications about how we can start to onboard people and move them in that direction. And the other one that I'll talk about today is how do we sort of help people understand how they can benefit from the technology more from a commercial or from a business aspect. For me, this is one of the things that the technology is disruptive, but I also think the way we have to now think about business models is really disruptive because we probably are going to have much smaller corporations in terms of the number of people, and we have a lot more partnerships and shared things. And I think that's as hard for people to understand and think about as some of the technology aspects. And I think we're in the early days in terms of the technology. We're even earlier days on anything that's sort of a viable or validated business or application model as well. So my goals for today for the learning aspect is to help you land an idea too. Hope you can take away and find the templates useful. We'll talk about some of the challenges, and then if time allows, from a networking perspective, if we go through the templates, then hopefully there's an opportunity for you to share with your neighbor and even sort of talk about some of the challenges that you're facing or seeing. What we'll cover today, this is sort of a typical design sprint that we use with clients. Not that very consistent with a lot of the frameworks that are out there. Think about the opportunity. Who are you seeking to serve? I think this is really important in this space in particularly. Also, is it a good opportunity? Trying to vet that earlier rather than later. Then sort of a process of divergent thinking. So really, what can all the mashups be? And then starting to converge on really where you should focus and how you should focus. And then that really leads into, I think, where the space really thrives and is quite good is how do you prototype it and start to get feedback. I see one of the challenges I see in that area is, well, how do you measure traction, right? And that's not unique to applications in a decentralized or blockchain space, but it is one I think that almost has more importance because it's really still ambiguous and hard for people to put down what is most important in the first steps. Two good resources if you want to read more in depth. One is the one that's based on what Google does and Google Ventures. So that is sort of the Sprint by Jake Knapp. The other one that is a great one, Moses Ma, who's a managing partner of Future Labs, has written one that's specifically on blockchain. So both of those are good resources to take a look at if you want to learn more about sort of what the design sprint mentality is and sort of how it gets structured and so forth. Okay, so let's jump into this in terms of step one, and we'll walk through it. So again, like I said, I hope everybody has an idea for how you want to make a dent in the world in terms of an application. This first step is what I do, and I help a lot of companies land their ideas. And I think in this space, it's more important than a lot of them in terms of being clear on this. And the way I tend to think about it and talk to people about it is, first of all, who is the audience that you want to help, right? This is more the end user in terms of what do you want them to get out of it? What is sort of, what are you trying to help them with? But this is being very specific on the person, their role, what their sort of context is. And then the second element is what is the change that you're trying to help them make? Almost every product that we buy helps us make a change in some shape, form, or another. It might be emotional, might make me feel more confident, might make me might change my status with how I get seen or I want to be seen. It might help me make more money, might make me save money, or it might help me mitigate risk in some shape, form, or another, or sort of the basic things that these help why we buy products. And then the last one is sort of benefits. And so, what are going to be sort of then the derived benefits? If I make that change, how am I going to start to benefit? And I think a lot of the decentralized applications, no matter where on that spectrum of sort of decentralization they are, getting really clear on this is really important. So if we think back to what people must have been thinking or could have been thinking back in 2009, right, when they were dreaming up Bitcoin as an example, right? So how do I give my audience, if I'm really thinking hard about the unbanked, for the unbanked would be a change of how do I create an opportunity for that population just to have access to the financial system, right? And so it's just how do I open up a door? How do I make it possible for them to engage within that system? And then the subsequent benefits would be, they'd have the ability to transfer money, they'd have the ability to sort of store money, they'd have the ability to sort of engage in commerce in a way that they hadn't done before. So let me pause there. Any sort of questions just on that framework or sort of any of the concepts? All right. So what I'd love to do is just give you interested, or even if you want to write down on a piece of paper, but just to give us a little bit of context as we go, if you have an audience in mind, let's just take a minute, jot down who they are, maybe sort of the change that you think that you would like to help them make and what those benefits would be. All right, I'll let you keep working on that as we go. So now before we go into sort of the next step, I wanted to share some key concepts that I think are important when thinking about sort of decentralized applications and some of the implications that they have. So I think one of the things that's exciting as well as sort of challenging, right? So blockchain in particular, has really created this opportunity for a lot of stuff to be disruptive in terms of applications, in terms of how we think about business models. And it's really causing us to sort of figure out where do we start? Right? I think is a big one. And so, one of the key shifts I see is this real movement towards decentralized over centralized. And this one on the business model, which I referred to at the beginning, I think is huge, right? I mean, we've been taught our whole, almost, for a long time, right, the best business model was basically a monopoly. And you were like, how do I create a centralized monopoly so that I can sort of control and see everything that comes through in order to basically create scarcity. And that combination of scarcity then allows somebody to monetize the value that's associated with that business. And I think this is completely being turned on its head now in terms of having, entities, commercial entities that are now networks of people and processes and tools that are all getting brought together and even managed now sort of in a decentralized manner to drive value. And so I think we're just at the early days of really sort of understanding how that's going to evolve. And I think for us as people and people that want to sort of make money and sort of earn a living, it's very different than having a salary and working for a larger company and starting to think about how I have predictability of income. So not only does sort of the technology moving from sort of centralized to decentralized, but I think the business models are moving there as well, which will take a lot more experimentation, right? We didn't know what we could do with sort of the internet when it was first started, right? It was all about putting HTML pages up and just sort of seeing what people would do with it before we ever really realized what would be the potential of a group like Facebook or a group where you had the traffic that Google has in terms of managing the ads and thinking about how to target that. So, us moving away from those models will take time, but we have to start to experiment. I think what we do know from the internet is those people that were out there standing stuff up, trying web pages, trying sort of designs on web pages, were the ones that became the early leaders about what's next, mainly because they were learning by doing and they learned faster than everybody else at that point. The second key shift, which is related for me, is that there is an ongoing shift in where value is derived and where value will be captured. And I sort of recall this as it's moving from the application layer into the protocol layer. And what I mean by that is you think about all the applications on the internet today, they're basically built on free protocols to enable us to interact via email, for us to enable us to interact sort of on the internet. But yet a lot of the sort of value now is moving into the protocol space. So whether it's the smart contracts or whether it's the currency, there is so much more value that will be regulated by the protocols that get connected together. And one of the things that I'm excited about, I think is super cool, is right with smart contracts and the micropayments, we will have the capacity to get paid for building a protocol and having it being used in all sorts of different ways, right? We'll have all these machine-to-machine connections that will make up a larger application, but the complexity of how we really stitch all of that together is sort of to be determined as we work our way through the space. But for me, this is one of the big shifts, going sort of from the application layer to the protocol layer in terms of value. And I think the third shift, which is another challenge for us to get over, and especially over from a consumer side, is this idea of individual security management. So going from delegated security management, what we basically all do today, whether it's with our passwords, in terms of just not writing anything that's sort of a super strong password, to really just even in the past 3 to 5 years having sort of LastPass and 1Password and all the other companies that have sort of started to develop to help us manage that, right? So that was sort of our first step when some of the early hacks happened. But now with Experian and Cap One and the other big ones, I think there was Overstock. There's all these sort of issues in terms of there being all of our information's already out there, and I think just now people are trying to figure out how they can manage it more effectively. But we still have a long way to go for, I think, masses to be comfortable managing sort of public and private keys. And so as we think about this and we think about applications, we have to think about how do we onboard these people? How do we get them moving forward and joining into the ecosystem so that they can sort of take part, and there's a growing sort of number of users and applications that can be successful. So if we look at, this is the original business model canvas. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it breaks up a business into 9 different areas. We think about it in terms of, on this side, customer segments. We look at sort of the relationship you have with the customers, the channels in which you operate with them, what the core value proposition is, key activities to deliver that, resources, partnerships, cost structure, and then revenue streams. And with sort of blockchain and decentralized, every one of them has an opportunity to be dramatically disruptive in terms of how you look at business models. And so it's not that you have to take on sort of change in all of them, but the opportunity to make changes and get to radically different places with the business model, I think is now much more accelerated than it has been a long time. And so just to pull out a couple, right? I think on the customer segment side, we have this opportunity of reaching people like the unbanked that really there's never been an opportunity before to really engage them in sort of the numbers and the way that we have sort of coming up. And then I think a challenge for a lot of businesses is the anonymous user. How do I really think about dealing with the anonymous user, and what does that mean? If you think about Facebook, use that as an example, they make derived revenue off of sort of users today because of the information that they're collecting. So now if it's an anonymous user coming into my company or my application, how do I engage with them, right? Am I willing to pay them sort of to access their data, or do I have to change how I sort of make money and charge them for the service and not have this sort of derived revenue that comes from sort of the advertisements today? I think one of the things that I find interesting thinking about is really on the cost structure side, is there are great opportunities for reduced costs because of eliminating the middleman and sort of using the distributed nature of a lot of the systems. But there's a lot of new costs that we don't understand yet in terms of all of the sort of fees, the gas that we'll have to pay at different parts of the system to make sure that the sort of crypto economic incentives are aligned to have sort of the overall network perform and behave in a way that we want to have the stability. And so you've got I think the 2 key categories, right? You've got your miners, the people that are going to run the nodes to maintain it. You're probably also going to have to pay sort of licensing for smart contracts and for the protocols that I was mentioning earlier. And then you might even have sort of authentication fees that you'll need to pay at different points for other people that are involved in the network. So there's just a cost structure that we still have to define and have to learn more about how it plays through. In terms of how we engage with people now, sort of with their wallets, with their smart contracts, there's marketing disruption with people using sort of browsers that protect their privacy to a much greater extent. So there's not sort of that additional revenue stream. So it's really causing a lot of the applications to be rethought in very different ways. So a couple of the challenges of sort of the decentralized applications that I sort of see and in working with people are, in fact, they're no different than a lot of the sort of ventures today. I think the harder thing is that they potentially are more impactful if we don't get them right because of the complexity of the space and the number of moving parts. So the first one is focusing too much on the tech. So what I mean by that is a lot of the applications that we've seen in the space today have been, I would say, for early adopters, for techies developing them for other techies, right? So we show a lot of the keys, we show a lot of sort of the underlying internal workings within our applications, and we haven't abstracted it out to where it will be more palatable for consumers to start to onboard and adopt. I think trying to do too much it's one that almost every company faces when they start off, right? They just say, I want to be everything to everybody, and they end up being nothing to in this sort of nobody. So really trying to figure out how you get started and where to start, I think, is a key aspect, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. Not being specific enough with the use case. So again, trying to be the best at solving X, I think has a much better record and sort of opportunity for success than trying to solve broad use cases. And that is both from a technology perspective, but also from how do I market it, how do I sort of develop the user interface, and how do I solve the hardest problems that might be involved with that application. Not being targeted enough on the audience, this is one that within sort of design thinking and in general with application development is really key, because it gives us a bit of a North Star to always be designing against and thinking about. So if we really know who we're going after and who we're trying to start, then we can have much better and deeper conversations with users. We can write, I think I would guess that none of us should ever be in a focus group if somebody's trying to develop a new sort of decentralized application, right? We already know too much and have points of view. We need to go pull someone off of the street and really talk to them. And again, if we have a really defined user group, then that's helpful to be able to understand and go have those conversations to understand how we get greater insight in terms of what we need to do to get them excited about it. Because chances are it's more about education and it's more about the benefit of the change that we're helping them make other than the technology or it being decentralized or blockchain. And then the big one in terms of the end is it really not being simple enough, right? So again, to this trying to do too much or trying to show off. I mean, as an engineer, I know early in my career I was guilty of this, is like you get so excited about what you built, you want to show off the how, but it really doesn't matter in terms of the business or the application. It's all about the benefit and the change and just getting better at how we talk about that with people rather than the how we do things, at least sort of initially and in the marketing materials, is super important. So a couple of key questions that really sort of think about and talk to people about with a lot, and I encourage, in fact, we'll talk about this a little bit here, is where to start. So I think about this in three different ways. There's so much to be done in this space. I encourage people to think about what is your primary sort of mission in terms of that you want to do with your application. And I believe that there's sort of three main opportunities. One is, do I want to prove something technically? Like the reason I'm going to build this application in the short term is to validate a technical ability to do X, to issue a non-fungible token or to take payments through a browser, using a cryptocurrency. Whatever it might be, is my goal to use an application to prove a piece of technology or technical capability. Second one is engagement. Am I building an application to show that I can develop a better user experience, to engage with consumers and get that learning? Because we have a ton of that learning that still needs to take place. And then the third point of view is, am I trying to prove the commercial viability of an application, either to have it stand on its own or for it to become a business? And so I tend to, even if the destination is to be sort of a commercially viable entity, I tend to think of these things as island hopping, right? So you've got all these different islands you can go to along the way to ultimately get there. And if you think about it, that anytime you're in the water, going between islands, you're at risk, right? You're putting capital at risk. You haven't landed something. The question is, how do I sort of go to a series of islands to then get to my destination in terms of an overall business model application that works? And so I believe you can start in any one of these areas, but again, it goes back to having focus. You just sort of need to know where you want to go and how you want to start. And then the second part is who to focus on. And this is a little bit about that, for me, that spectrum of decentralization and how do we start to encourage and onboard people. So I have the three groups I pulled out here are the techies, and I'm going to sort of take a leap of faith, and I'm going to sort of put all us into that we're sort of excited about the technology, just willing to jump in and sort of experiment with a lot of stuff that's out there. I think there are then what I would refer to as sort of status seekers, that they're people that have heard about blockchain, they want to be seen to be using some of this. It might be because they believe in the cause or they want to be seen to be early adopters. And that's a really great audience as well. They have some enthusiasm, but we might be able to get some real benefit from them because they're not as deep in the tech as we are. And we can start to see how maybe more general customers would use an application. And then the disruptors is really what I was thinking about was like the unbanked, right? For me, it's when we can develop applications for that group of people is when we really disrupt. And I think we start to realize some of the vision and the potential of the technology. There's a company called M-Pesa, so M-P-E-S-A, which I think it was sort of mid-2000s, was introduced in Africa. And it was a way to do peer-to-peer payments on a Nokia mobile phone. So it was the Nokia one, I forget the model number, I had one, but it was sort of battery lasted forever. You could do SMS and sort of transfer money. And that was revolutionary at the time, not only for that population, but sort of globally, because they had a cellular network and they just leapfrogged all the other financial services. And so I think that is sort of the challenge for us. How do we make sort of what we believe as an application that would have a potential to captivate the larger numbers of people that really could benefit from it in a way that from a simplistic application they could easily understand and start to adopt. And for me, that's when I think the disruption starts to happen. So let me pause there and just sort of see if there's any questions or people have thoughts on any of the sort of concepts that I've sort of talked through so far. Yeah.
Are you engaging right now with larger kind of incumbents at all who might be starting like pilot projects, proof of concepts? Are we starting to move beyond that stage, or just depends on the audience?
I think it depends on the audience. A lot of the work that we're doing more work in sort of the gaming space and in the sports areas because I would say our goals are around a lot more of the engagement. People are trying to say, so in the sports world, we're looking at fan-to-fan engagement, use of tokens. How do I sort of bet with the person sitting next to me to earn a token that might give me sort of greater access to either other tickets or to the players? And then, so I think there's a lot of activity there. I think on an enterprise grade level, which we're not doing any work, but there is work around sort of, they're looking at sort of more of the private blockchains of how do we build systems, and we're starting to do, you see the supply chain and you see sort of areas in there. And that's all outside of the cryptocurrency sort of coin and sort of some of the area, the experimentations in the securitization. All right, any other thoughts, questions? Okay. So let's divergent thinking. So now that you have your idea, right, one of the things that's really important is to give yourself the freedom to think about all the different things that, you could do and not constrain yourself. And I think this is often one of the ways that sort of people really limit the potential or don't come up with as many good ideas as they can. I think we're really early on, and sort of I had heard one of Andreas's talks, which I thought was great, and he referred to something that's called skeuomorphic design, where we take sort of any new technology and we apply it to the problems that we have today. And I thought a really good example that he had used was when steel was first invented, we used it to build one-story and two-story houses, right? We didn't use steel to build sort of the 110-story skyscrapers until much later, even though there was no change in the technology that was enabling the skyscrapers. It just took us a long time as humans to sort of think about and get to a point where we could come up with designs and applications that were more complex about how we applied it. And I think that's the same thing that's going to happen with sort of blockchain and sort of the distributed technologies that we're starting to play with now. I encourage all of you, and I talk to everybody, your first idea, the ideas that you try don't have to be disruptive. This is a marathon, not a sprint, right? When I was doing sort of my PhD work, I think one of the best pieces of advice I got from an advisor was just look to add a little small puzzle piece onto the larger puzzle on the edges, right? You don't have to break off and create a whole new puzzle. You just have to add to it. And if you do that enough, then you're going to really help progress the body of work moving in that space. And I think as we think about applications collectively, that's sort of what we have to be thinking about. How do we just pick a real clear focus, make a contribution, and do it again? And I think that's where you can build your way into an application and sort of making an impact or a dent on the world that is meaningful. And whether they succeed or not, I think they regardless, they all help us move forward, right? And in fact, I think it's well argued that our failures help us move forward more quickly than our successes. So something fun that you guys heard of OK Go. It's sort of a band that's still around. There is a great TED Talk where they talk about how they find their ideas for their videos. And if you're not aware of OK Go, has some of the most brilliant videos that I've ever seen. They've got this one here that is the image behind them. So they play a live music, sort of a live sort of song, and in the background they have this video sequence that they have slowed down, I think, 10 times. So they filmed it at a super high speed, but then we're able to slow it down. And when there's an image of it where they have this book flipping pages, and so the sort of lead singer's vocals match up with the mouth movements of the guy flipping the book. It's absolutely spectacular. And what they talk about in their video is that they give themselves this space to have crazy ideas, and what they refer to is they find their invention. That if we think about the fact that typically if we really don't force ourselves or encourage ourselves to go there, we tend to go to ideas that have already been tested and already been tried. And we are very reticent to try to bring in and think about untested ideas. But that's a much bigger universe, and there's a good probability that a lot of the untested ideas will still work. And that's where we can find more disruptive solutions. And so there's this opportunity where you just need to give yourself a little bit of space to play. And when I sort of am working through with people in a longer workshop, we do this, and we haven't gotten to that question of should you even be doing a blockchain yet, right? I always get to use that later. One, because I don't want to discourage ideas, but two, we've got to have the freedom of thinking about stuff and then coming back to it and say, okay, now let's sort of take a look at it, and how do we evaluate it, and does it make sense? So OK Go as a TED Talk, it's sort of, I think it's about 20 minutes long, but it's sort of fun to watch. Okay, so now that you've landed your initial concept of who your audience is, the change you want to make, and sort of the benefits, and then sort of riffed on a bunch of ideas about now how might that happen? What are all the different ways, things that you could mash up and bring together to sort of help that come to life? You want to start to converge on really what your model is going to be and what the application could start to look like. And so some of the templates that I have next really sort of helps that process. And so the first one is really sort of thinking about a value proposition statement. Again, everything we've done so far really is sort of trying to be as jargon-free as possible. And if you think about how you would want to explain your idea, the sort of formula I use with a lot of people is, okay, it's an A, right? So this needs to be something tangible, a service or a product that you're talking about that does B, right? This is really where you're talking about the change that you're helping people make. So that C, which is your audience, and being as specific as you can D, right? So that ends up being the benefit. So it's just a good little formula that I would encourage you to start to think about doing multiple versions of it so that you can bring it to life and share it with people. It's one of the easiest ways to test your application is just try to put it in this format and start to see if it resonates with people. One of the things that we'll do, even with sort of blockchain-oriented applications, is do this and then start to run Google ads that sort of have some of the key takeaways and the key messaging from these statements, just to figure out whether people care. Can we get enough people to click on the ad and send them to a landing page as an early indicator that, hey, I think the promise that we're making has real potential with sort of the audience that we're trying to serve. So this is what the template in your pack looks like, so you can play with it and sort of use it. we'll skip this, but I'm happy to sort of talk about questions here in a sec. When you do share it with people, I mean, I think the key thing here is to say, hey, do you get it? Do you understand it? What resonated? What doesn't resonate, when you're talking with people as you go through it? Great way to iterate and get ways to improve, right? This is all before we've built anything in terms of trying to understand, how the application can be made better. Okay, so then once you have all of that, sort of the next sort of step I sort of recommend is really starting to get it down on a template that we came up with that's a little bit more custom for decentralized applications. And really what we're trying to sort of emphasize here is some of the new things like ecosystem. Who else do you need to be engaging with? What are you going to do with sort of the miners? What are you going to do for sort of authentication of any sort of transactions or events that you need to validate? Who are you going to deal with from a smart contract perspective, right? Where's some of the people that you might end up having to pay? You have to start thinking about governance. You can drop in what your value proposition is, and this is the first time that we're now starting to get to blockchain, right? So why blockchain? Why blockchain over sort of a standard database? And so here, you have a couple different paths. And one of the things I've found that's super cool about this is you get here, and even if you say, I don't want to do blockchain, but you filled in an a customer group and sort of a benefit and a change and sort of a value proposition that all makes sense, well, still means you still might have a really great sort of application or business idea, right? You haven't thrown away a good idea just because a very first step might have said, hey, don't do it with blockchain. But now you get sort of the opportunity to think about the trade-offs in terms of whether you really want it to be open, whether you really are going to take advantage of sort of the tamper-resistant, sensor-resistant capabilities, or if you might be willing to make compromises because that objective that we talked about earlier is actually, it's more important just to start engaging or help introduce people to the technology. All are valid choices that you get to make as you go through the process. This is another way I just sort of, the audience, who are you trying to serve with sort of the product, right? I mean, who are going to be the users? And in some cases, if the user is different than the buyer, then you might want to pull those out there. But that's really the people that you're trying to help with the product that you want using it or you want to sell it to. So one of the last areas then, once you've sort of gotten this down, and just a little bit of background, the reason I'm a big fan of these templates, these sort of one-pagers, and the reason being is I think that you write a business plan at the very end, once you have validated a lot of stuff, and I have found and observed that it's a great way to have a coffee with somebody with a one-pager, and the amount of feedback you get is fantastic, right? You're not trying to flip through a bunch of slides. Hey, I want to sit down, I want to chat about X, and you can show them a summary, and it really becomes a great way to have a conversation, and actually a deeper conversation about stuff than if you're trying to flip through something that's more formal. But one of the things I really like to do then is sort of what I call key assertions. So these would be, what are all the things that have to be true for your application to be a success? And there's two reasons that I think are really great to be doing this. One is it helps you highlight what do you need to test first in terms of feeling confident that you're moving in the right direction. The other thing that I think is fantastic is it helps you define a problem. So if we're focused on engagement with consumers and we come in and we say, we need a way for our browser to connect with a wallet without a consumer ever even knowing we're doing that, and make sort of payments look as if you're using PayPal, right? That then becomes an assertion, and now you can go to somebody that is in the game of building those sort of APIs or those connections from a technical perspective and ask them to solve that, right? So you could build a whole application that was based on maybe 2 or 3 technical assertions, prove that out, right? Prove your ability to engage with consumers and then come back and solve the technical problem secondarily. which is sort of the reverse of way I think a lot of stuff is happening now. We are starting with all of the hardest technical things that we can find, and we're sort of trying to say, all right, what are all the barriers why this might not work, as opposed to say, let's go find things that will work with consumers and then help prioritize technical problems by backing our way into it. So it's I think those are two reasons that starting to think about the assertions can be super helpful. And the governance is one that I think, you've got to assert what you think is going to be true and start to have conversations about how you're going to deal with consensus, how you're going to deal with sort of members, how you're going to deal with the voting, and sort of the management of that whole ecosystem within sort of a decentralized application that you're developing. So it's at this point where I start to say, okay, well, now's the opportunity to have a little bit of a sanity check, right? So does blockchain make sense? Does making your application decentralized, does it make the application stronger? Right? For me, this is like the Slack, right? The more people that are on it, the more valuable it is for us. I think the same thing can be said for decentralized applications. It should be true that the more people that get on it, the more people that are in the ecosystem are helping sort of increase the value of the applications that are associated. We then get in this environment just like we have with Bitcoin, where everybody's incentives are aligned not to basically try to undermine the ecosystem if everybody's sort of bought in and in getting value out of sort of the progression and the improvement of the ecosystem as a whole. And then does it have the potential to be commercially viable? And I think the basic equation here is, do you think you can charge enough for it? Do you think you'll be able to earn enough? Or is there a high enough volume to earn a little bit? And I think this is an area where probably as individuals, but also collectively, we have to rethink what commercially viable starts to mean in terms of how and when we collect sort of payment. Are we happy to earn sort of tokens that might appreciate in the future, which is a very different way for people thinking about compensation as opposed to sort of getting sort of cash or sort of currency straight away. Okay, so to wrap up, I encourage you to think about then, as you go through this process, how you might do the next steps. So the next steps traditionally would be thinking about how you would prototype it. That could be low fidelity, high fidelity prototypes, and then starting to sort of collect data. So once you have your prototype, sharing it with users, getting feedback, and starting to think where you are on that roadmap of validating everything. What we have gone through, and I hope you've found helpful, we went through the first 3 steps of sort of the design process. We talked through some of the key concepts that I think are creating both opportunities as well as challenges within sort of the development of decentralized applications, and some of the shifts that are then causing that. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I encourage you now to go out and make the dent in the world. We've got a few minutes left, so happy to answer any questions that you might have.